The cool night air wrapped around the group of friends as they approached the cemetery's rusted gates. The moonlight filtered through the thick canopy of trees, casting long shadows on the worn stone path that led deeper into the forgotten graveyard. The night was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot and the soft chirping of crickets in the distance. "Are you sure about this?" Rachel's voice broke the silence, her eyes darting nervously to the crumbling tombstones that surrounded them. Her heart was pounding, but she didn't want to admit it. She wasn't the only one who felt uneasy, but she was the only one brave enough to speak up. "Come on, Rachel," said Alex, trying to sound confident. "We've talked about this for weeks. It's just an old graveyard. There's nothing here except dead people." He chuckled, but it sounded hollow even to him. Rachel frowned, but she didn't argue. She had known Alex since childhood, and he was always the one pushing them to do things they'd regret. This time, though, there was something in his eyes, a glint of excitement mixed with a hint of nervousness, that made her uneasy. Behind them, Sarah and Ben exchanged uneasy glances. Sarah, who had always been the quiet one of the group, tugged at her jacket as she glanced around at the cemetery's neglected gravestones. The others had been eager to explore, but Sarah had grown up with stories of haunted places, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to stir up something they couldn't control. "I still don't get why we're here," Ben muttered. He shoved his hands into the pockets of his hoodie and scuffed his sneaker against the dirt. "You've all seen the news, right? Weird stuff happens in places like this." "Oh, come on, Ben. Stop being such a buzzkill," Alex replied. "It's all just superstition. We're here to have fun, not to get scared." But fun wasn't what Rachel was feeling. As they stepped further into the cemetery, the air seemed to grow colder, and the atmosphere grew heavier, as if the very earth beneath them had been waiting for them to cross some invisible line. As they ventured deeper into the graveyard, the ground beneath their feet became uneven. The tall gravestones leaned like tired old men, their inscriptions worn away by the passage of time. The moon seemed to hang lower in the sky now, casting an unnatural pallor over everything it touched. "All right," Alex said, stopping in front of a particularly old grave. "This is the spot, the unmarked grave." Rachel hesitated, staring at the unmarked stone. It was so old it had blended into the landscape, and the ground around it was disturbed, as though someone or something had recently been there. There was no name on the gravestone, just a small, cracked stone slab that seemed to resist the inevitable decay of time. "I don't like this," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "You're just scared," Alex teased, stepping forward and brushing away the overgrown weeds to reveal the grave's edges. "There's nothing here, I promise." But Rachel could feel something wasn't right. She couldn't explain it, but the unease in her stomach grew as she stood there, staring at the grave that was so out of place among the others. The air grew colder, almost as if the earth itself was breathing beneath her feet. Ben, who had been quiet until now, stepped forward with a determined look. "If this grave is really as old as you say it is, then we should dig it up. See what's really under here." "Ben, no." Rachel grabbed his arm, but he shook her off. "Why not? It'll be fun. We'll be the first ones to uncover it." His grin was wide and reckless, and there was something almost wild in his eyes. Alex nodded, encouraging him with a smirk. Rachel's heart raced in her chest. "Don't do it. Something feels off." But it was too late. Ben had already begun digging. With each shovelful of dirt he removed, the chill in the air grew stronger, and a strange sensation crawled up Rachel's spine. The moonlight seemed to flicker, as though it, too, was unsure of what would happen next. Alex knelt down beside Ben, his curiosity overcoming any lingering doubts. "Come on, Rachel. It's just a grave. It's probably empty anyway." The minutes stretched on, and soon the hole was deep enough for them to see a small, old wooden box beneath the surface. It was strangely intact, as if it had been placed there only yesterday. But Rachel knew better. No one had been here for years, decades, maybe. The unease in her chest deepened, and her breath quickened. She could feel someone watching them. Ben grabbed the box, his hands shaking as he lifted it out of the grave. The earth seemed to groan in protest, and a low, muffled sound echoed in the distance. At first, it was so faint that Rachel thought she had imagined it, but then it grew louder, a scraping, dragging noise that seemed to come from beneath the ground. "Guys, let's put it back," Rachel urged, her voice barely a whisper. Ben looked at her, still grinning. "Don't worry, Ratch, we're almost there." But as he lifted the box higher, the scraping sound grew louder, and the ground around them seemed to tremble. The moon overhead flickered once more, and then everything went silent. Then, without warning, the ground beneath their feet shifted, and the earth seemed to crack open. Something moved, something dark and ancient. The box fell from Ben's hands, crashing to the ground with a deafening noise that echoed through the cemetery. Rachel's heart stopped as she watched in horror as something began to emerge from the cracked earth. Something that had been buried for far too long. And in the distance, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as the darkness around them seemed to grow heavier. The moon, which had been a bright silver just moments ago, now appeared pale and weak. It seemed to shrink away from the ground where the box had fallen, as if it too was afraid of what was being unleashed. Ben was the first to react, stepping back with a nervous laugh. "It's just the ground shifting. Probably an animal burrowed under it." But Rachel wasn't convinced. The scraping sound continued, louder now, as if something was clawing its way up from the depths. She could feel the coldness in the air, like a presence, something ancient and alive, stirring beneath their feet. "What's happening?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, barely audible over the sound of the earth groaning. She gripped Rachel's arm tightly, her face pale and filled with fear. "I told you we shouldn't have dug it up," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "There's something down there, something we shouldn't have disturbed." Before anyone could respond, the ground shifted again, and a jagged crack ran through the earth beneath the unmarked grave. The air smelled of damp soil, and the once still night was now filled with the unsettling sound of shifting earth. And then, from the depths came a whisper, a voice, so faint at first that Rachel thought it was only the wind. But it wasn't. "Help me." The voice was soft, raspy, as if it had been trapped for centuries. It sent a chill racing down Rachel's spine, and she could see the others frozen in place, eyes wide with fear, not knowing whether to run or stay. "Did you hear that?" Ben asked, his voice tight. He had stepped back from the hole, but his curiosity kept him rooted to the spot. "Who's there?" Rachel asked, her voice shaky as she took a cautious step back. But there was no answer, just the haunting sound of earth moving and the unmistakable sensation of being watched. It was then that the ground cracked wide open, and an arm, pale, thin, and covered in dirt, reached out from the blackness below. It was followed by another, and another, until a figure slowly began to rise from the earth, dragging itself upward like a corpse that had been pulled from its grave. Rachel gasped and stumbled backward, her breath caught in her throat. The others followed suit, their legs shaky, their bodies trembling in terror. The figure that emerged from the earth was unlike anything Rachel had ever seen. Its skin was ashen gray, its eyes sunken and hollow. Its hair was long and matted, tangled in the dirt. It wasn't human, couldn't be. The thing that crawled out of the grave was an abomination, something that shouldn't have been able to walk in the light of the living. The spirit's eyes locked onto Rachel's, its empty gaze piercing her soul, and for a moment, she couldn't move. Time seemed to slow, and she felt as if her very body was being drawn into the darkness that surrounded the figure. The spirit's mouth opened, and it let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that chilled her to the bone. "Run!" Alex shouted, breaking the spell that had kept them frozen in place. He turned and bolted toward the cemetery gates, and the others followed, their feet stumbling over the uneven ground as they rushed to escape. But Rachel didn't move. Her feet were rooted to the earth, and all she could do was watch as the creature rose to its full height. Its body was skeletal, wrapped in tattered, rotting clothes that hung loosely from its frame. The air around it seemed to shimmer, thick with a malevolent energy that made her skin crawl. "Rachel!" Sarah screamed from a distance, her voice filled with panic. "Come on, we have to go!" But Rachel couldn't tear her eyes away from the creature. She didn't know why. She didn't understand it. All she knew was that she was locked in place, her body trembling, unable to break free. The spirit moved toward her, its movements slow but deliberate, as if it had all the time in the world. The air around it grew colder with each step, and the ground beneath her seemed to pulse in rhythm with the creature's movements. Suddenly, the creature stopped just inches from Rachel, its hollow eyes boring into hers. A breathless, rasping sound echoed from deep within its chest. And then it spoke, its voice a whisper that seemed to come from both within her mind and from the earth itself. "You shouldn't have come here." The words were barely audible, but Rachel understood them perfectly. They sent a shiver down her spine, and the feeling of dread grew heavier with each passing second. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature reached out a long, bony hand, brushing against her face with cold, clammy fingers. Rachel gasped and pulled away, finally breaking free from the spell that had kept her rooted to the spot. "Run!" she screamed, her voice hoarse with terror, but it was already too late. The creature let out a low, mocking laugh, a sound that sent chills up her spine. The others had stopped running, and now they were staring at her, their faces pale with fear. Rachel turned to run, but the earth seemed to pull at her feet, dragging her back toward the creature. With every step she took, the ground beneath her felt as if it was trying to swallow her whole. She stumbled and fell, her hands scraping against the cold dirt as she tried to push herself back up. But the creature was faster. It was right behind her now, its cold breath hot against her neck, its fingers grazing her skin like claws. The ground beneath her gave way, and she tumbled into the darkness. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the earth. The others were too far away to help, their voices faint and distant. She was alone in the dark, with nothing but the creature for company. And then, everything went silent. Rachel's heart was still racing in her chest, the beat quick and frantic. Her mind spun in a whirl of confusion and panic. She had fallen, but there was no pain, no immediate sensation of injury. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed her, and now she was floating weightless, suspended in the darkness. But then came the whispers. At first, it was faint, barely audible, like a distant echo of someone speaking in a language she couldn't understand. Then it grew louder. The voices were all around her, circling like vultures, each one a low, guttural sound that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. Her eyes strained in the dark, but there was nothing, only shadows. The deeper she fell, the darker it became, as if she were descending into the very bowels of the earth. Rachel struggled to rise, to get a grip on the ground that felt as if it were slipping through her fingers. She reached out, but her hands brushed against something cold and hard, stone. She pulled herself up, one hand finding purchase on something smooth and slick. It was rough like an old, weathered tombstone. Her breathing quickened. She wasn't falling anymore. She had stopped. But where was she? The ground beneath her felt solid, but she was still lost in this suffocating dark. Rachel's panic turned to dread as she realized she couldn't remember how she had gotten here. There were no more whispers now, only a suffocating silence that made her stomach twist in fear. Her thoughts raced as she tried to piece everything together. She had fallen into the grave. The others had been right there, but now they were nowhere to be found. Had they left her behind? Or had something happened to them too? Ben? Sarah? Alex? She called out into the darkness, her voice shaky and uncertain, but there was no response, not even an echo. She blinked, her eyes adjusting to the inky blackness, and began to crawl forward. Her hands slid along the surface of the stone, feeling the rough edges beneath her fingertips. She wasn't sure where she was going, but she couldn't just lie there, paralyzed by fear. She had to move, had to find the others. After what felt like hours, Rachel finally made out a faint, dim light ahead. It was barely visible, like the soft glow of a candle in the distance. She clung to that light, crawling toward it with all the strength she had left. As she crawled closer, the light grew stronger, but it wasn't from a candle as she had first thought. No, it was a soft, ethereal glow coming from the earth itself. The ground in front of her seemed to pulse with an unnatural light, as if something beneath the surface was alive, stirring and writhing. Rachel stopped just short of it, her breath hitching as she peered into the glowing fissure in the earth. The light flickered like a dying flame, casting eerie shadows across the walls of the pit. And then she saw it, a face, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes staring back at her. It was barely more than a shadow in the light, but it was unmistakable, human, but not quite. The face twisted into a grotesque grin, its lips curling upward in a mocking, malevolent smile. "Who are you?" Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. The face didn't answer. Instead, it seemed to melt away into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that it had been waiting for her, watching her. She drew back, her heart pounding. She wasn't alone down here. Something else was with her. Something that had been lying in wait for centuries. Rachel's instincts screamed at her to run, to find a way out before whatever this was came for her. But she couldn't move. Her legs were like lead, and her body felt heavy, as if the very air around her was weighing her down. Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder now, echoing through the pit. There was no way to tell where they were coming from, but they were everywhere, swirling around her, filling her mind with 1,000 different thoughts all at once. "Help me! Get out! Run! Before it's too late! Rachel!" The sound of her name broke through the chaos, and she spun around, her breath catching in her throat. Ben, she called out, her voice hoarse with emotion. "Where are you?" The darkness seemed to close in tighter, and she could hear footsteps now. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. Someone was moving toward her. "Rachel, where are you? We've been looking everywhere." It was Ben's voice, and Rachel's heart leaped in her chest. She had to find him. She had to get out of this hellish place. But just as she started to move, a cold hand wrapped around her ankle. She screamed, kicking and thrashing, but the grip tightened, pulling her back toward the center of the pit. Her heart raced, and she fought desperately to free herself, but the hand that held her was impossibly strong. "Help!" she screamed, her voice barely above a whisper in the overwhelming silence. The whispers in the darkness grew louder, more frantic. "Leave now, or join us." The grip on her ankle loosened suddenly, and Rachel was yanked forward, face down against the cold stone. She gasped for breath, panic rising in her chest. What was happening? What was pulling her back? She turned over, and there, standing just a few feet away, in the dim light of the pit, was the creature. Its hollow eyes were locked on her, and its lips twisted into a grin. "No one leaves," it said, its voice low and echoing. Rachel's heart stopped, and then, without warning, the earth beneath her feet gave way, and she fell, tumbling deeper into the darkness. Rachel's body felt like it was tumbling through an endless void. She couldn't see anything, only pitch black, as if the world had swallowed her whole. Her mind spun wildly, desperate for a grasp on reality, but there was nothing. No ground, no air, no sense of time or place, just endless freefall. She slammed into something hard. The impact knocked the breath out of her lungs, and she gasped, trying to orient herself. Slowly, she pushed herself up, her hands scraping against cold, jagged stone. Her vision was blurry, but she could make out the faint outline of what appeared to be a stone wall, rough, ancient-looking, and covered in some sort of strange, slimy substance. Her heart raced. Was she in some kind of underground tomb? The thought alone sent a chill creeping up her spine. She could barely breathe as the smell of earth and decay filled her nostrils. Rachel struggled to rise to her feet, feeling her way along the stone, trying to calm herself. She couldn't let panic take over, but it was hard not to. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to escape, but the darkness pressed in on her like a suffocating blanket. The air was thick, and every sound seemed amplified. Every rustle of her clothing, every breath she took, felt impossibly loud. Her pulse hammered in her ears. "Ben," she called again, her voice shaky. "Alex? Sarah? Can anyone hear me?" The words echoed back to her in the eerie silence, but there was no answer, no sign of life, just that thick, oppressive darkness that seemed to swallow any trace of sound. She stepped forward, careful not to stumble, feeling the cold stone beneath her bare feet. Each step felt heavy, as if the earth itself was trying to pull her down, to hold her here in this forgotten, forsaken place. As she moved, a sudden chill crawled up her spine, as though she wasn't alone. Rachel froze. There was something, presence, a cold, malevolent force lurking just out of sight. A whisper echoed in her mind, soft and insistent. "You shouldn't have come here." Her breath caught in her throat. The voice was unmistakable. It wasn't in her head. Someone or something was speaking to her. She whipped around, scanning the darkness. But there was nothing. No movement. No figure. Her hand trembled as she reached out, brushing against the wall. The stone felt rough, almost alive, as if it had a heartbeat of its own, pulsing with a strange, unnatural energy. She recoiled, horrified by the sensation. Then, she heard it again. The whisper, "Leave or suffer." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't just leave. She had to find Ben, Sarah, and Alex. They couldn't have just vanished. They had to be somewhere. They had to be. A low, guttural sound broke through the stillness, and Rachel spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. The sound was distant at first, but it grew louder, closer. It was like a slow, grinding scrape, as though something was dragging across the floor. Something big, heavy, something that shouldn't be moving. Her eyes widened as the darkness in front of her seemed to ripple, as though the shadows were alive, shifting and twisting like smoke. Then, from the very depths of the darkness, something emerged. Slowly, with deliberate slowness, a figure began to take shape. A shadow impossibly tall, its outline shifting in the dim, flickering light that seemed to come from nowhere. Rachel's breath hitched in her throat as the figure moved closer, the air growing colder with each step. She could see nothing of its face, only the vague outline of its body, twisted and warped. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by unseen strings. The whispers grew louder, echoing from every direction. "You woke it. Now you'll pay." Rachel's body went rigid with fear. She couldn't move. She couldn't scream. All she could do was watch as the figure continued to approach, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "No, no, no." The thing stopped in front of her, its shape now fully formed in the shadows. It was tall, so tall that its head nearly brushed the ceiling, its limbs impossibly long, and its body twisted in a way that defied all logic. It had no face, no eyes, no features, just a mass of swirling shadows where its face should have been. Yet Rachel could feel it staring at her. Its gaze, if it could even be called a gaze, was suffocating, like a weight pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Then it spoke. "You shouldn't have disturbed me." The voice was deep and guttural, like the earth itself had spoken. The words rumbled in the air, vibrating through her body, making her skin crawl. Rachel wanted to scream, to run, but her legs were paralyzed, as though the very presence of the creature had frozen her in place. Suddenly, the creature reached out, its hand, a long clawed thing, grabbing her by the wrist. The cold that radiated from it was unbearable, like ice, seeping into her very bones. She gasped in pain as the creature's grip tightened, pulling her closer. Its fingers dug into her skin, and the darkness around them seemed to grow thicker, swallowing everything. "Please," Rachel begged, her voice barely a whisper. "Let me go. I didn't mean to." But the creature didn't answer. Instead, it dragged her forward, its form dissipating into the shadows, leaving nothing but the cold, crushing darkness behind. Rachel's vision blurred, and she felt herself being pulled deeper, further into the pit, into whatever nightmare awaited her. Her mind raced. This was it. She was going to die down here, alone, lost to whatever this thing was. There would be no one to help her, no way out. But then, just as the darkness threatened to swallow her whole, she felt something. A flicker of light, faint but undeniable. A distant glow just out of reach. Rachel fought against the creature's grip, pushing with all the strength she had left. The thing was relentless, but she didn't care. She had to get to the light. It was her only chance. With one final burst of energy, she broke free, stumbling toward the glow, her heart pounding in her chest. The creature shrieked behind her, its voice a chilling, otherworldly sound. But Rachel didn't look back. She couldn't. She just had to reach the light. And then suddenly she was there. Rachel's hand shot out, gripping the edge of something cold and metallic. It was a ladder. She had no idea how it had appeared or where it led. But it didn't matter. She climbed as fast as she could, her breath ragged, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. But just as she reached the top, a hand shot out from the shadows, grabbing her ankle. She screamed, kicking, but the grip was too strong. "You can't escape," the voice whispered, and then everything went black. Rachel's eyes flickered open, but the world around her remained dark. The same thick, oppressive blackness she had been plunged into before swallowed her whole. Her head throbbed painfully as if she had been struck by something heavy. She raised her hand to her forehead, feeling damp, sticky sweat clinging to her skin. She was lying on something cold, hard, and uneven. A stone floor, perhaps. For a moment, she just lay there, trying to make sense of what had happened. Her breath was shallow, and her body trembled uncontrollably. Her heart raced in her chest, and every nerve screamed at her to get up, to move, to escape this nightmare. But when she tried to sit up, a sharp pain shot through her side, causing her to gasp in agony. What had happened to her? The last thing she remembered was being dragged down into the darkness, her wrist gripped tightly by the twisted creature. She had been so close to escaping, so close to that flicker of light, but then the hand had grabbed her. The memory sent a wave of panic crashing over her, but she forced herself to breathe, to steady herself. She wasn't dead. She couldn't be. She was still here, alive, at least for now. Slowly, she pushed herself up, gritting her teeth against the pain in her side. Her hands scraped against the cold stone as she struggled to get her bearings. Her surroundings were eerily silent. No whispering shadows, no echoing voices, nothing but stillness. The air smelled damp, like old earth, and the faint scent of decay lingered in the air, making her stomach churn. Rachel forced herself to her feet, every movement slow and careful, as though the darkness itself might reach out and grab her again if she moved too quickly. She had no idea where she was, or how she had gotten here, but she knew one thing. She needed to get out. "Ben?" she called weakly, her voice shaky and thin in the still air. "Alex? Sarah? Anyone?" There was no answer. Her pulse quickened, the silence pressing in on her. She felt utterly alone, trapped in some forsaken place where nothing was real and everything was out of her control. Her thoughts were a blur of confusion and fear. She stumbled forward, her eyes straining to see anything in the pitch-black darkness. Her foot caught on something, a raised edge of stone, and she fell to her knees with a grunt. She braced herself against the cold floor, her hands shaking as she tried to right herself. The sensation of something watching her pressed against her chest like a weight, suffocating. But when she looked around, there was nothing. Not that it would have mattered if there was. She was alone in this nightmare, and nothing would make it stop. As she stood, forcing her feet to move, the silence around her seemed to become even more oppressive, like something was drawing closer. Rachel's breath hitched as she strained to listen for any sounds. All she could hear was the pounding of her own heart, the sound of her ragged breaths, and the soft, echoing sound of her footsteps as she moved through the dark. She pressed on, unsure of where she was going, but knowing that standing still would only make her a target. She needed to find a way out. She had to get back to her friends. She couldn't leave them in whatever hell this place was. As she walked, her eyes adjusted slowly to the dim light, faint and far off in the distance, like the glimmer of a candle in the distance. The small light was the only thing that seemed to offer any sense of hope in this suffocating blackness. Rachel picked up the pace, ignoring the pain in her side and the exhaustion that weighed down on her legs. She had to reach it. She had to get to the light. Could be the key to everything. But the closer she got, the more unsettling the light became. It flickered unnaturally, like the glow of something about to extinguish. It didn't seem to come from any clear source, like a candle without a flame, just a faint, unnatural glow. As she moved closer, a sudden cold wind brushed past her, sending a chill straight to her bones. The air turned heavy, like the temperature had dropped dramatically in an instant. She hesitated, suddenly uncertain. What if it was a trap? What if it wasn't the way out, but another trick to pull her deeper into whatever nightmare this place was? Rachel stopped in her tracks, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, to find another way, but it was too late. A sound broke the stillness. It was a low, guttural growl, a snarl. Then, something shuffled through the dark. Her heart stopped. The light in the distance flickered one last time before it went out, leaving her in complete darkness once more. The growl came again, closer this time, echoing off the stone walls. Rachel's blood ran cold. Something was coming. Something awful. Something she couldn't outrun. She needed to hide. Fast. Her eyes darted around, but there was nowhere to go. No door, no shelter. Just stone walls closing in around her. She pressed herself against the cold surface of the wall, holding her breath, trying to quiet the frantic beat of her heart. The growl was growing louder, closer. She could hear footsteps now, slow and deliberate, like something or someone was stalking her. And then the voice, a whisper, faint but clear. "You should never have come here." Rachel's stomach twisted as fear crept up her spine. It was the same voice she had heard before, the one that had whispered to her when she had first entered this place. It had to be the creature, the evil that had awoken. Suddenly, the growl was right next to her, and a cold, bony hand shot out of the shadows, grabbing her arm with unnatural strength. Rachel screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. She tried to pull away, but the grip tightened, and the coldness of the hand seeped into her skin like ice, numbing her. "Let go!" she screamed, kicking out, but the hand didn't budge. The voice spoke again, this time much closer. "You're ours now." She didn't know what it meant. She didn't care. She fought with everything she had, twisting and struggling against the grip, but it was no use. Her legs felt weak, her energy draining with each second she spent in this hellish place. In one final act of desperation, Rachel grabbed the stone wall beside her and used it for leverage, twisting her body and breaking free from the grip of the creature. She stumbled backward, her breath ragged and wild. For one long moment, there was silence. Then, a sound like the scraping of metal against stone echoed from the darkness. And then, out of the shadows, the figure emerged. It was tall, impossibly tall, and it towered over Rachel. Its body seemed to bend and twist, limbs too long and too thin, as if it were more of a shadow than anything solid. Its face was nothing but a hollow void, an absence of anything human, and its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed with an unnatural, sickly yellow light. And it was smiling. The creature took a step toward her. Rachel's heart hammered in her chest, her breath coming in quick, panicked bursts. The creature, tall, twisted, and impossible, moved closer, its long limbs scraping against the stone floor like the sound of nails on a chalkboard. Every inch of its body exuded a palpable sense of malice, and Rachel could feel the weight of its gaze even though its face was nothing more than a black void. She stumbled backward, her hands pressing desperately against the wall for support. Her mind raced. There had to be a way out, a way to escape this nightmare. She couldn't face whatever this thing was. It was beyond human comprehension, but there was nowhere to run. The corridor stretched out endlessly before her, and the light she had been chasing was now completely extinguished. She was alone, trapped in a place where reality and fear blurred together, and the walls seemed to close in with each passing second. The creature moved again, and Rachel's instincts screamed at her to flee. Without thinking, she turned and ran, her feet pounding against the cold, uneven stone. Her breath caught in her throat, her legs burning with exhaustion. But she pushed herself harder, running blindly through the dark. She had no plan, only the primal desire to escape, to survive. But no matter how fast she ran, the growl of the creature seemed to echo behind her, relentless and growing louder. It was always there, a dark shadow that never gave up its pursuit. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet shifted, and she stumbled. Her body pitched forward, and she hit the ground hard, her palms scraping against the rough stone. The pain shot up her arms, but there was no time to dwell on it. She scrambled to her feet, her heart racing as she continued to run, pushing through the pain, but the sound of the creature's growl intensified. It was too close now. She could feel its presence, a suffocating force closing in on her from every direction. Rachel glanced over her shoulder, her breath catching in her throat when she saw the creature moving faster than she could comprehend. Its grotesque form gliding effortlessly through the darkness, its limbs stretching unnaturally long. It was gaining on her. Her thoughts scattered, but one thing was clear. She had to get to the door. She didn't know where it was or what it led to, but it had to be her way out. It had to be. As if on cue, she saw a faint glimmer of light ahead, a doorway, barely visible in the distance. Her hope surged. The door, the escape she had been searching for. She ran toward it, her legs feeling like lead as she pushed herself harder. The growl of the creature was deafening now, and she could hear the scraping of its fingers against the stone, the rhythmic thud of its steps. It was right behind her. She could feel it. Rachel reached the door, her fingers trembling as she gripped the handle and threw it open. The door creaked loudly, protesting her force, but she didn't hesitate. She stepped into the room on the other side and slammed the door shut behind her, her breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, everything was silent. The oppressive darkness that had swallowed her whole seemed to pause, holding its breath. Rachel stood frozen, her back pressed against the door, her eyes wide as she listened intently for any sound of pursuit. But there was nothing. No growl, no footsteps. She let out a shaky breath, wiping the sweat from her brow. She had made it, at least for now. She didn't know what was waiting for her on the other side of that door, but she had to believe it was safer than being in the hallway with that thing. She took a few cautious steps into the room, her eyes struggling to adjust to the dim, flickering light. The air was musty, thick with the scent of decay and age. Dust motes danced in the faint light, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. It looked like an abandoned room, with old furniture covered in sheets, cobwebs hanging from the corners, and the unmistakable feeling of neglect. There was a strange stillness to the room, one that made Rachel feel uneasy, as if she had just stepped into a forgotten corner of the house that no one had dared to enter for years. The feeling was suffocating, like the walls were closing in on her. But then her eyes landed on something that made her blood run cold. At the far end of the room, there was another door. This one was old and weathered, its surface warped with age. The wood was cracked and splintered, and the faint outline of symbols seemed to be carved into its frame. The symbols were strange, foreign, and unsettling. Rachel's stomach churned as she stared at them, unsure if they were some sort of warning or invitation. The door seemed to beckon to her, pulling her toward it, but she couldn't. She shook her head, trying to clear the fog of fear clouding her thoughts. She had to think. She had to make a plan. There was no way she was going near that door without knowing what lay behind it. For a moment, Rachel stood frozen in the center of the room, her eyes darting from one corner to the next, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The silence was oppressive, thick with the weight of her fear. She could still feel the presence of the creature pressing against her mind, but she had no idea where it was. Was it still following her? Was it waiting for her in the shadows? The room felt claustrophobic now. The walls seemed to inch closer with each passing moment, and the oppressive darkness outside the room felt more dangerous than ever. She couldn't stay in here forever. But the door, it terrified her. She was about to turn away, to search for another exit when a low, guttural whisper broke the silence. "You're not alone." The words slithered into her ears like a serpent's hiss, sending a shiver down her spine. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she turned to face the source of the voice. But the room was still empty. A cold sweat broke out on her skin as the whispers continued, growing louder, more urgent. "You've woken it. It's too late. It will find you. Rachel's breath hitched in her throat. The voice, who was it? And why did it sound so familiar? She glanced back at the door with the strange symbols, and her legs moved of their own accord. She felt drawn to it like a moth to a flame, but as her fingers reached for the handle, she stopped. A cold, icy sensation gripped her wrist, freezing her in place. Then, a voice spoke again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a scream, a wail of pure agony that seemed to echo from the depths of the room, bouncing off the walls, vibrating through her bones. "Run. You're running out of time." Rachel's eyes widened in horror as she heard footsteps behind her. Too late. Rachel's breath came in shallow gasps as she stood frozen, the icy grip on her wrist tightening, its unseen fingers sending electric jolts of fear straight into her core. The cold, spectral presence continued to whisper in her ear, its voice growing louder and more frantic. "You've awakened it. You've doomed us all." The words were not her own thoughts, nor were they the echoes of her fears. No, this voice felt like it was from somewhere deeper, beyond the grave, from some place that was beyond the realm of the living. The air around her felt colder, heavier, as if the room itself was drawing her into a suffocating embrace. She had to act. She had to do something, or it would be too late. With all the strength she could muster, Rachel yanked her wrist free from the unseen grasp. The force behind it almost sent her tumbling backward, but she managed to stay upright, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers turned into a deafening roar in her ears, a chorus of screams and wails that clawed at her sanity. It felt as though the very fabric of the room was coming apart. Turning quickly, Rachel sprinted toward the strange door with the symbols carved into the frame, her pulse hammering in her throat. It was the only way forward, and even though every part of her screamed to avoid it, she knew she had no choice. She gripped the handle with both hands, her fingers trembling as she turned it. The door groaned as it opened, revealing a dimly lit passage beyond. The air inside was thick, stagnant, carrying the smell of earth and decay. It felt ancient, older than the house, older than the cemetery itself. This was not just a room. It was a place that had been forgotten by time, a place where the veil between the living and the dead was at its thinnest. Rachel's skin crawled as she stepped inside, but the air here was different. It wasn't suffocating, it was more inviting. A soft glow emanated from the far side of the passage, and Rachel's instincts urged her to move toward it. Despite every ounce of fear in her being, she was drawn to the light, as if it held the answers to the nightmares that had been plaguing her since the moment they had found the unmarked grave. With every step, the whispers grew fainter, and yet, a new, more powerful force began to surge through the air. It wasn't a voice this time, just a feeling, a presence, something ancient and angry that had been stirred into action. The light grew stronger as she approached it, taking on a bluish hue, casting eerie shadows along the walls. When Rachel finally reached the source, her breath caught in her throat. At the center of the room stood an altar, ancient and covered in dust, adorned with worn symbols that matched the ones on the door. It was an unholy place, a place where rituals had been performed long ago. But what made her blood run cold wasn't just the altar. It was what lay atop it. A stone slab, cracked and weathered with age, had a figure carved into it. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than an intricate design. But as Rachel stepped closer, her eyes widened in horror. The figure was not just a symbol. It was a depiction of a face, an entity, its eyes wide open, staring back at her with a chilling intensity. She recognized the face. It was the same face she had seen in the dreams, the same face that had haunted her the night before, staring out from behind the veil of sleep. And now, it stared at her from the cold stone, its hollow eyes dark and knowing. She stumbled backward, her chest tightening as panic surged through her veins. This was the thing that had been unleashed. This was the evil spirit that had been dormant for centuries, waiting for someone foolish enough to awaken it. And now it was awake. Rachel's mind raced, searching for any way to stop what had already been set in motion. She couldn't let it escape, couldn't let it spread beyond these walls. The room was growing colder, the air thick with the weight of the entity's presence. It was like the very fabric of the world was warping, bending around her, threatening to pull her into a void from which there was no return. The whispers returned, but this time, they were not in her ears. They were in her mind. Destroy the stone, or it will consume you all. Rachel's eyes darted to the altar, her gaze locked on the stone slab. There was no time to question, no time to think. She had to act. With trembling hands, Rachel searched the altar for anything that might help. Her fingers brushed against a metal object hidden in the dust, and when she pulled it out, she realized it was a small, rusted knife. Its edge worn but sharp enough to do what was necessary. Without hesitation, she brought the knife down on the stone slab, carving into the figure's likeness. The moment the blade made contact, the room seemed to shake, and a loud, bone-rattling scream filled the air. The figure on the stone cracked, its eyes widening even further, and Rachel felt the ground beneath her feet tremble as if the very earth was fighting against her. But she didn't stop. She pressed harder, carving deeper. As the air grew heavier, darker, the figure began to break apart, and as it did, a piercing, inhuman screech echoed through the room, causing Rachel to stagger back, clutching her ears. Then, in a final, deafening explosion of sound, the figure shattered. The room went deathly silent. Rachel stood panting, her body trembling from the intensity of the moment. She had done it. She had stopped it, at least she hoped she had. But there was no time to rest. The very air around her felt charged, as if something unseen was watching her, waiting for her next move. She slowly turned toward the door she had entered, but as she did, she felt a presence behind her, cold and unyielding. Slowly, she turned around, her heart skipping a beat. The altar was empty, and standing in its place where the shattered figure had once been was the entity itself. Its form was no longer bound to the stone. It stood in the center of the room, its dark eyes fixed on Rachel. It was no longer the figure on the slab, it was a living, breathing nightmare. The air turned to ice as it began to move toward her, its shape shifting with each step, its limbs elongating, growing longer, more twisted. Its mouth opened, and Rachel saw rows upon rows of jagged, razor-sharp teeth glistening in the dim light. "You cannot destroy what is eternal," the entity said, its voice a low growl that reverberated through her bones. Rachel backed away, her eyes darting around the room for an escape, but there was none. She was trapped. And then, the entity spoke again, its voice dripping with malice. "It has only just begun."